Um, in a session in the Silicon Valley on power, or in a session on power today, I've taught a class on power for many decades, actually, and we all have come to understand that we live in a new world. Many of my students say, you know, you remind me of some 15th century prince or author who wrote about a prince, which is probably true. There are days in which I feel about that old. But we have new power for new times. You know, we're in the Silicon Valley. We're all high-tech people. We have new communication technologies. Hierarchy's dead. Racism and sexism is dead. We live in a world of, you know, some postmodernist paradise. And there's a lot of talk, as there was, and I think it's very appropriate talk, about empowerment and about building strong organizational cultures and about building a world in which people, like, you know, love each other and all kinds of other good things. And then, of course, you wake up in the morning, and if you are a sentient human being, you look at the news and you see that the world that we believe we're living in bears very little resemblance to the world, in fact, that we are living in. And so what I would like to do in a very brief period of time is explain to you the realities of power. I wish they weren't true. I gave a talk, actually, I guess it was less than 2 nights ago, in Brussels, and one of the people at the talk said, "This sounds very depressing." And I said, actually, it depends upon what you think is depressing. What I find depressing, to be brutally honest, is the following. Much to, I think, people's surprise and astonishment, a significant fraction of Stanford MBAs, these are Stanford MBAs, not Cal MBAs, Stanford MBAs, smart, wonderfully well-trained people, a significant fraction. The number is not precise because nobody gathers data on this, but a significant fraction, some people will tell you as high as 20%, will lose their first job within 2 years because they will get fired. Depending upon the data that you look at, somewhere between 25 and 70% of otherwise successful executives will suffer during the course of their career what is euphemistically by the Center of Creative Leadership called a career derailment. Many of you understand a career derailment for what it actually is, which is getting fired. I find those statistics depressing. This morning, having flown back yesterday, I guess, I had the privilege of addressing a group of young Asian leaders, emerging leaders. The program for Asian emerging leaders, which is sponsored by a company that I shouldn't mention since they happen to be a competitor for Shell, is worried about developing their Asian leaders because, just as in the case of women, for Asians or Asian Americans, as for women, at the very bottom levels where you look at, you know, where careers are basically based upon individual performance, individual success, and intelligence and motivation and such as that, no problem. The higher you go, the smaller the numbers. So the promotion of diversity is an issue not just for women, which it clearly is, and if you look at the Catalyst data, it is completely flat basically over the last 15 years, and this is true in law firms, and it's true around the world. So I give a talk to them, and I find it depressing that in 2013, approaching 2014, we still have work organizations in which there is career derailment, in which people are not getting ahead, particularly women and minorities, including Asian Americans and including, of course, African Americans. I find it depressing that a significant fraction of Stanford students, hopefully not my students, but actually they don't always learn the lessons either, find themselves in career problems. And the reason why all of these things come to be true is mostly because people don't understand the reality of power dynamics. So I'm going to explain to you the reality of power dynamics and also give you my perspective on why they are relatively constant both across cultures and over time and why nothing ever changes. Number one, first fact of life. Contrary to what you may have read, hierarchy still exists. To the best of my knowledge, there's only one president, and it's not Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, at least yet. There is one president. There is one CEO of every company. In companies which have tried shared governance, seldom lasts very long. One school superintendent, one mayor, one governor. Hierarchy exists. Hierarchy exists among animals. Our dear friend Jim Collins gave me a book called Chimpanzee Politics. You can picture what that's about. Hierarchy exists, and by the way, hierarchy is chosen. According to research by my colleague Laura Teetens, when you give people who are assigned to accomplish a task a choice of organizing arrangements, they pick hierarchy. So hierarchy's here. It's not going away. We would like to hope that it's going away. It hasn't. It isn't. It probably isn't going to. The second fact, as long as there's hierarchy, most people would prefer to be nearer the top than the bottom. In case you haven't been reading the news, people at the top make more money than the people at the bottom. But something that you may not know about, according to research by Sir Michael Marmot, famous British epidemiologist, knighted by the Queen, written in a book called The Status Syndrome, it turns out that people at the top live longer. Literally. Power is related to lifespan, which if you think about it makes, of course, perfect sense, because you know what they say, something flows downhill, and you would rather be the flower than the flowee. Power gives you control over your life, and therefore you live longer. So, now, number one, hierarchy exists. Number two, people would prefer to be higher status rather than lower status, which of course follows and makes sense. Third, people say, well, okay, it's fine that hierarchy exists and that there is competition. Isn't competition decided on the basis of the merits? Well, everybody knows that isn't true. This year, the Oakland Athletics have done it again. With the fourth smallest payroll in baseball, the Oakland Athletics have won their division. How did they do this? Well, if, in fact, rewards in baseball were perfectly correlated with merit, it would be impossible for the Oakland Athletics to exploit what is essentially a market imperfection and put together a winning team out of a set of people who are not being paid their full market value. What is true in baseball is certainly true in other domains as well. The race doesn't always go to the smartest or to the fastest. The race goes to the people who, in fact, can win the race, and those skills require many other things. Now, turns out there are two fundamental dimensions by which we evaluate human beings. And research shows that this is true actually across cultures. People immediately evaluate others on the basis of warmth, likability, if you will, and competence. The paradox is as follows. Even though I'm sure everybody in this room is both warm and competent, empirically, people tend to see warmth and competence as being negatively related. So, to put it simply, you can look at Amy J.C. Cuddy, a famous social psychologist at Harvard's article, nicely summarized by its title, "Just Because I'm Nice, Don't Assume I'm Dumb." Or Teresa Amabli's article, "Brilliant but Cruel." We assume competence. If you're nice, it must be because you're not too competent, which is unfortunate, but it is in fact the case. Or to quote the Israeli, now deceased Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, and one of the most profound sayings I have ever heard, and you should think about this for a long time, because the more you think about it, the more meaning there is to it. Don't be so modest, you're not that good. Think about that. Because we assume competency and warmth are negatively related, it isn't case, even though my friend Bob Sutton made a fortune writing his famous book, which I'm sure many of you read, and if you were unfortunate had somebody give to you anonymously, the no asshole rule. He, of course, had to put in a chapter, which I insisted, called The Virtue of Assholes. And he did, of course, his famous Google search, which is to pair the word asshole with the names of a bunch of CEOs, to see who came out on top, and you can guess who it was, who won by 4 times the number of number 2 on the list. So warmth and competence implies that you need to make some trade-offs about life, and sometimes you need to be competent rather than warm. We'll talk more about that in a second. Next, most fundamentally, if I said to you, I can give you one principle by which you could understand all of human behavior, and it's one principle. And that principle is called, we're going to give you that principle and many derivations from it. The principle is that people like to think good of themselves. The idea is self-enhancement. We are motivated to think positively about ourselves. We self-enhance. Now, the manifestations of this are many. One manifestation of self-enhancement is what is called in the literature the above-average effect. And the above-average effect is just this. Take a random sample of any set of human beings, including the people in this room, and ask them anonymously to respond to the question, are you above average in any positive attribute? Are you above average in height, intelligence, sense of humor, vocal ability, writing ability, income? It turns out more than half of the people will say that they're above average, because, of course, we like to think of ourselves as above average. Since we like to think well of ourselves, there's another consequence. We love people who remind us of our favorite person, who is, of course, ourselves. If you do a Google search on the New York Times website, which I guess is a contradiction in terms, if you go to the New York Times website and search using the exact phrase, within quotes, "You remind me of me," you will see a very nicely written summary of the research that demonstrates the most powerful and effective way to get people to like you and to influence others is, of course, to imitate them. Literally. Stanford Virtual Reality Lab has actually done things where they have avatars that imitate with a 4-second delay, because it turns out if you do it immediately, people know you're imitating them. But if you imitate them with a 4-second delay, it turns out that the avatars that imitate with a 4-second delay, not 3, not 6, 4, are more liked than and we're talking about motions, gestures, all the things that I'm doing up here now. Turns out if you do that with a 4-second delay, I will like you. You remind me of me. We like things that remind us of ourselves. Research shows, believe it or not, that you are more likely to marry someone with the same initials. You are more likely to choose an occupation whose name reminds you of you, and the search of death records have shown that people are more likely than chance to die in cities whose names are or states whose names are similar to their own.